So, America, as a sole world superpower within the United Nations, America refuses to step aside and step down as the world's sole superpower. So, America is the bottleneck of the United Nations Security Council. America wants to set the rules for the world, the global base, world based rules, as America Washington feels fit. So that's, in my opinion, enslavement of the rest of the nations on earth. When one nation thinks that they can impose the world-based rules, the world-based orders, when one nation thinks that they can be the indispensable world sole superpower, when one nation thinks that they can have manifest destiny over the rest of the world because they revolve around a Washington Constitution. So it's like an analogy. It's like one man, George Washington, the Constitution of America, the delusion of politics on both sides of the aisles in Washington, thinking that they can rule over the world with impunity. That America, as a world sole superpower, can impose himself as a nation on the rest of the nations on earth. That's what I call enslavement, oppression by America on the rest of the nations on earth. So I'm, as a freedom fighter, as a liberator, marching towards making every nation have their equal place and their rightful place as sovereign nations on earth, to remove this imperial bottleneck that we call America as the world's sole superpower, in order to allow all nations to have their rightful place at the table. So what do I mean by that? Well, I want to abolish and vanquish America's ability as a world sole superpower from making up the world-based rules order as a Washington feels fit to do. So I want to vanquish that ability for America to have a hegemonic sole superpower over the world. So I want all nations to have their rightful place at the table, and for all nations to vote unanimously when any world-based rules are created as the laws of global affairs. I want every nation to have the right to vote unanimously to phase in any international accord, any international law that pertains to the sovereignties of all nations on earth. So I want all nations to have the ability and the equal voting power. So when the rules are made up for the world international norms of laws, that they will be voted and afforded and accorded by all nations on earth. When all nations have equal permanent status as United Nations security members, and when all nations have equal votes as permanent members within the United Nations Security Council. So that's my mission statement, is to liberate the world, to be a revolutionist on behalf of the world, to afford all nations to have their rightful place at the table of international laws. For they can all be afforded the equal rights to vote for whatever norms of world-based rules that are phased in by all nations on earth to be considered equal with unalienable rights. So I'm facing an uphill battle. I'm facing an uphill battle in this Washington Monument, or Capitol Mount of Washington, D.C. I'm facing an uphill battle with the aristocracy of this Washington Mount of D.C. It's hard to bipartisanly get these politicians to coalesce to the New World Order. Because they feel they're entitled as a world sole superpower to rule over the world with impunity. Because they feel that the world revolves around our Constitution in America. They feel like the world has to revolve around and accord to the Constitution of Washington, D.C. And I'm here to tell y'all, no. The world doesn't revolve around y'all. The world is not revolving around this George Washington Constitution that bipartisanly the Democrats and the Republicans try to uphold and subvert over the rest of the world by oppressing the world with Washington imperialism. That is not a just system for the rest of the world. That is a self-greed, self-gluttony, abomination of a derangement that they call manifest destiny over the world. That revolves, as an analogy, it reminds me that they are trying to be like pagan Washington adornments around the Washington Monument as a pagan symbolism. They want to prop up Washington on the world stage with impunity to be a world sole superpower. And the rest of the world can care less about your delusions of manifest paganisms, of political rhetoric in Washington, D.C. The world wants to be free and liberated. All nations on earth wants to be afforded the equal right to sit at the table of international norms and have the same voting power as sovereign nations on that permanent United Nations Council, Security Council. So what I'm doing is working with Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, to evolve the United Nations into a fair distributed system for all nations on earth. So instead of America making the world-based rules as they feel fit as a world sole superpower, which is a bottleneck system on the world stage and under their treasury, and the world-based rules as the economical laws of the world, it's a trickle-down economic system. An analogy, if you turn that mighty dollar on its backside, it's a Ponzi scheme. As an analogy, that mighty dollar is a Ponzi scheme, a trickle-down economics on the rest of the world. When America, after Bretton Woods, created the world-based rules for the international economic systems, it was served to serve the interests of America's mighty dollar. And now you got President pigs like Trump that wants to keep the world enslaved to the American petrodollar and then tariff our allies with a gluttony of greed, and the rest of the world to be subverted under this pyramid of the almighty dollar with perpetual serfdom under a trickle-down global economic system. So I'm working on new economical theories to do away, to eradicate this gluttony of a world sole superpower that we call America on the world stage. The United States of America. I want to be able to sit all nations on earth on the permanent members of the Security Council. And when the rules-based orders of the world is accorded to, it will be unanimously voted upon by all nations on earth. Not like it exists today with veto power. Then you got the West, you have America, Britain, and France. And then you got China, Russia and China on the other side. And between this tug of war, between these permanent members, America uses its veto power as a third European permanent member status. America likes to use its veto power to keep the world pegged to America's whims. So for that reason, I'm dissolving the 5 permanent members. And I'm allowing all nations on earth to be considered permanent members with equal sovereign rights, with equal voting veto power. As individual nations, they will all have their equal voting power. They will all be permanent members. And so I'm leading a world revolution within the United Nations to afford and accord all nations their right, their sovereign rights. And America stands in my way. That mount of Capitol Hill, D.C., of pagan politicians bipartisanly, whether it be the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, they all want to manifest destiny as the indispensable world soul superpower on the world stage. So yes, as an analogy, I will rip the togas out of them. I will crumble their foundations if they dare stand in my way. So as an analogy, I like to use the history of the Senate of Rome, when Rome was an empire. And when the senators of Rome used to roam with gold reliefs and togas, because America emulates Rome and Washington senates, where lifelong senators can try to set the world-based rules as a hegemonic power. So yeah, it reminds me of Rome, the American Senate, the Capitol building. It all reminds me of Rome. So while the world is enslaved under this world imperial power of Washington, D.C., I refer to it as an analogy as Washington pagans, worshiping American Constitution that revolves around George Washington. So I like to use analogies just to point the dire truth of the hypocrisy of the one nation on the world stage running amok, like America has done on the world stage. So I'm here to tell America step aside and step down, as well as the 5 permanent members to step aside and step down, and let all members of nations on earth to be seated equally at the table of international norms. And when laws are accorded internationally, all nations will have their voting rights adhered to. When the rules are adjusted and accorded, when it comes to the norms of international laws, it will be afforded by all nations having equal voting power as permanent members. This is the new world order for the United Nations, the evolutionary system that the United Nations needs to phase and be phased in order to be a just global system. The United Nations have to evolve. It can't stay static and stupid on America's dime of imperialism, as America has gluttony over the world. Ever since World War II, America thinks that they're entitled to rule with impunity on the world stage as the indispensable world soul superpower. So I'm here to wake up Washington to the realism of the new world order within the United Nations, that all nations have the right to sit at that table and to be heard, and for all nations to have the equal voting power and have a say in the world-based rules of accorded laws globally. So yes, I'm fighting an uphill struggle against Washington, the Mount of Washington, D.C. But have no doubt that when I reach that mountain and I move the movement of the global order, I will rip the togas away from these senators that stand in my way. I will eradicate this pagan belief in George Washington on the global stage if Washington dares stands in my way. America, you're not considered a world soul superpower anymore. America, you're not the indispensable world soul superpower hegemonically on the world stage no more. I will crumble your foundations of hypocrisies and your hypocritical oaths as politicians when you swear yourselves into public office in this republic. I will crumble your foundations to allow all nations to be free and liberated on the world stage. America, you have to learn to get along with every nation. You have to learn to sit humbled at the table of nations. And for you not to be considered a world hegemonic power. As a matter of fact, only America is considered in my book one nation. And so they have one vote. And they're not better or powerful than any other nation when it comes to the permanent members of all nations in the Security Council. America is just one of many nations. And America is not better or powerful than any other nation when it comes to making the world-based rules. So I'm here to eradicate the belief that Washington has on the world stage, that they delusionally think that they're the world's sole superpower and that they're entitled to rule over the world with manifest destiny. Those days are coming to an end. Those delusion in your heads as politicians in Washington, I'm going to eradicate. Y'all backward thinking and y'all delusional on the world stage. So I want all nations to be seated as permanent members and for all nations to have equal veto power or voting power when the world-based rules are accorded to and voted upon. By all nations to have the freedom to make up the rules of the world-based orders as the nations of good conscience of all nations on earth should be accorded to by the goodwill of all nations as permanent members. I have no doubt that this is a world movement. I have no doubt that this is a world revolution. I have no doubt that all nations will be free and liberated within the United Nations.